Welcome to the OSHA New Silica Standard for Construction conference call. My name is Allie and I will be your operator for today's call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct a question and answer session. Please note that this conference is being recorded. I will now turn the call over to Bill Jenkins, CNA Risk Control Consultants. Bill, you may begin.
Thank you. I'd first like to thank everybody for joining us today. Hopefully we can help you sort out this new standard and answer any of your questions at the end of the webinar. In preparation for this webinar, I had the opportunity to spend time with an OSHA industrial hygienist not too long ago, and I got a better understanding of some of the issues and questions of the new standard. We discussed that the standard is currently held up in legal review by a petition from the Construction Industry Safety Coalition, which is made up of 25 trade associations, including the ASCC. Some issues would probably change, but there was no doubt the standard is here to stay. Now there's already been an update to the standard as recent as last week regarding the enforcement date, which we'll discuss shortly. There's no question the better we can protect our employees, the better off everyone is. OSHA's previous permissible exposure limit, PEL, for silica was established in the 1960s, and that's roughly 50 years ago. OSHA estimates that the new standard will save over 600 lives and prevent more than 900 new cases of silicosis, lung cancer, COPD, kidney disease each year once the effects of the standard are fully realized. Additionally, OSHA projects the new standard will provide net benefits of about $7.7 billion annually, which this is also challenged by the Construction Industry Safety Coalition, which estimates that actually it's going to cost construction contractors in the industry billions. All right, this is the CNA disclaimer. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but to paraphrase, this webinar is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal or professional advice. Give you a minute there. All right, important date, the OSHA Silica Construction Standard. The final rule was published on March 25th of 2016 and became effective on June 23rd of 2016. Enforcement was originally scheduled for June 23rd of this year, but according to the April 6th news release by the U.S. Department of Labor, the enforcement date has actually been pushed back to September 23rd, 2017. So they're giving us an extra 3 months. The update stated that, and this is a quote, "It has been determined that additional guidance is necessary due to the unique nature of the requirements in the construction standard," unquote. Now the state could even be pushed back further. The coalition which I mentioned, which the ASCC is part of, is actually requesting that the enforcement date be extended to June 23rd, 2018. And incidentally, that is the general industry enforcement date in 2018. Now, the next two bullet points pertain to accredited laboratory requirements and methods of sampling for analyzing air samples, such as specific analytic procedures, quality control programs, instrumental calibration criteria. Going back to the general industry enforcement date, depending on specific operations and customers served, your company may fall into the OSHA's general industry standard. Enforcement of the standard, again, will not begin until June 23rd of 2018. And while we're focusing on the construction industry for today's webinar, many of the items highlighted here will also pertain to general industry. Scope and application of the standard. This is what the standard applies to. It applies to all occupational exposures to respirable crystalline silica in construction work, except where employees' exposure will remain below 25 micrograms per cubic meter of air at an 8-hour time-weighted average under foreseeable conditions. Now, the 25 micrograms per cubic meter of air, that's what they call the action level, which is the level that OSHA requires increased industrial hygiene monitoring to begin at. How do we determine if our construction work is under that action level, that 25 micrograms? Well, the biggest thing we do is air sampling. We can use historical data, and that's why OSHA established Table 1, which we're going to look at more closely a little later. It's 18 recognized activities where historical data has proved to be over the 25 micrograms. We also can use trade data, air exchange calculations, but basically, if you see a dust cloud, you're probably going to be over that 25 micrograms. Now, if you can prove that the exposure is under that action level of 25 micrograms, then you don't fall under the scope of the standard. But the only real way to prove this is through air sampling. And in construction, we have to be careful of that because our job sites and projects are so dynamic, the conditions are always changing. So what might be good one day might not be good the next, depending on weather conditions. All right, the requirements of the standard. The standard requires that employers limit worker exposure to respirable crystalline silica exposure above the PEL, the 50 micrograms over an 8-hour day. Now, when we talk about respirable or respirable, we mean breathable. The silica particles have actually been processed or broken down small enough to breathe in your lung, either through grinding, polishing, chipping, that type of thing. The PEL of 50 micrograms, we have to remember now, that has been reduced down from the original 250 micrograms per cubic meter of air that OSHA has established over the past 50 years. So we're dealing with really 1/5 of the exposure what we've been used to. We have to establish and implement a written exposure control plan that identifies the tasks that involve the exposures, and we have to implement engineering control. Now, the written exposure control plan, this is really no different than a job safety analysis or a job hazard analysis. In a nutshell, we identify the exposure and we describe how we're going to control it. At an OSHA-sponsored seminar I attended, they provided a website, and we're going to look more closely at this website later on. It's www.silica-safe.org. It actually walks you through completing one of these plans. We're also going to have to designate a competent person to implement and oversee our whole exposure written control plan. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, define what a silica competent person is. We're going to restrict housekeeping practices that expose workers to silica. Okay. Housekeeping practices could be water, sweeping compounds, vacuuming systems. It could be restricting the blowing of dust with compressed air or mechanical sweepers. It could even be using a water truck at a job site to keep the dust down. Continuing on the requirements, we have to provide respirators to workers when engineering controls cannot limit the exposure to the PEL, the 50 micrograms. Now, when we reference respirators in this new silica standard, it's under the assumption that we're in total compliance and up to speed with the current respiratory protection program that actually has been in place since, I believe, 2007. We need to offer medical exams, including chest x-rays and lung function tests, every 3 years for workers exposed at or above the action level that wear respirators for 30 days or more per year. We have to keep records of the workers' silica exposures and all the medical records and everything like that for 30 years. And we have to train workers on operations that result in the silica exposures and the way to limit them. Now, if an employee wears a respirator for 30 days or more a year, we're going to have to follow the medical surveillance requirements. So we're going to talk more detail about that in a little bit. Prescribed engineering and work practice control methods. Table 1, specified exposure control methods. For each employee engaged in the tasks identified on Table 1, the employer should fully and properly implement the engineering controls, work practices, or respiratory protection specified for the task on Table 1. If you comply with Table 1, you do not need to monitor for silica or comply with PEL. Let's look at the next slide here, give you a better idea of it. Now, this is just a small screenshot of Table 1. OSHA identified 18 common tasks or activities that produce silica above the PEL, and they placed them in a table along with the engineering controls and the respiratory requirements to reduce the silica exposure. If you look up toward the top left corner of that slide where you see 1926.1153C, all right, if you go to the OSHA website and in the search engine, you put that number in there, it'll bring up the complete table. It'll bring up the complete Table 1. It's actually 2.5 pages long. If you want to reference the complete silica standard, it's actually found in the 1926 construction standard under subpart Z, which is toxic and hazardous substances. You'll see in this small screenshot here, I've highlighted some boxes in red. How you read this table, if you go down on the left side where it talks about equipment and tasks, you go down to the second item there, number II, held hand power saws. This can be as simple as a handheld gas-powered concrete saw, which many contractors are using nowadays. That's the equipment. Engineering and work practice control methods. If you go across from II and you see it says use saw equipped with integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade. The key here is integrated water delivery system. That means, as OSHA defined it when I talked to them, they said that the water system has to be integrated into the actual piece of equipment. Following along with that, you go down to the next little red box, and if you use it when used outdoors, and you go across, if you use it for 4 or less hours per shift, according to Table 1 on this particular task, no respiratory protection is required. Now, if you use that same tool and you use it indoors or in an enclosed area, they're going to say that respiratory protection is required with an assigned protection factor of 10, which is actually an N95 respirator. It can be a disposable 3M respirator, CN95. If for some reason an employee uses or completes 2 of these tasks or more than one task on Table 1, and it cannot add up to more than 4 hours. If it adds up to more than 4 hours, then we're probably going to have to use the respiratory protection, the N95 mask. So, bottom line, if you can work with Table 1, comply with Table 1, and do the requirements on it, you're not going to have to wear a respirator, which is really going to mean there's going to be no visible dust. And that's the key, because on a lot of the stuff in the standard, they refer to visible dust. That's the key. All right, there's notes. These are some initial notes that go to Table 1. All right, if you perform a task indoors or an enclosed area, provide a means of exhaust as needed to minimize the accumulation, and here it is, visible airborne dust. For tasks performed using wet methods, apply water at flow rates sufficient to minimize the release of visible dust. Again, visible dust. In other words, if you're putting water on it and you can still see dust, we're not putting enough water on it. The next bullet point there, that has to do with construction equipment. That has to do with things like excavators, loaders, any type of construction equipment out on the job site. And those tasks are actually in Table 1. They're the two very last, number 17 and 18, on the last page of Table 1. They have to do with the equipment, and you need to make sure that you have an enclosed cab or booth, that you have all practical settled dust out of the cab. All of your seals, your door seals and your window seals are in good shape. We've got positive pressure maintained throughout the cab, and we have a heating or cooling system provided on it. So, and again, we're going to answer questions on a lot of these different things afterwards. So, all right, if the task is not on Table 1 or you decide not to use Table 1, then you have to go to the alternative exposure assessment options, which get ready for air sampling or schedule monitoring. You know, hands down, if you can by all means use Table 1, it's the way to go if possible. I'm going to go to the next slide here that gives a little better interpretation of it. These are the alternative exposure control methods. You have the performance option and the scheduled monitoring option. And basically, they both involve air testing or air monitoring. The scheduled monitoring option, okay, it's done over an 8-hour time-weighted period, and you will place the badges, the monitoring badges on employees. You want to make sure that you select employees or an employee that is expected to have the highest exposure to the respirable crystalline silica. You can do a representative sampling monitoring, which according to OSHA can be around 10%. So, and you've got to watch out too when you do this air sampling, because the job sites are so dynamic, which means that the conditions are changing from day to day, whether it's the humidity, the wind, the direction, the speed. What might be good one day might not be good another day, so you really have to watch out about that. All right, if you do conduct the air sampling and the monitoring, and you have 5 days then to notify each employee of the results, 5 working days. Whenever an exposure indicates that it's over or above the PEL, the employer has a described written notification, the corrective action to be taken to reduce the exposure. And basically the corrective action can be engineering controls or worst case scenario respirators. Air monitoring, the employee's rights. If you perform air monitoring, okay, the employer shall provide the affected employees that are engaged in the monitoring, and their designated representative, which for the most part we're probably talking union rep, the opportunity to observe the monitoring process. Okay, if while doing the monitoring, if there's any specific PPE, personal protective equipment, anything like that that the employee needs or the representative needs, we have to supply that as the employer at no charge. You know, it could be as simple as safety glasses, hearing protection, a Tyvek suit, anything like that. Methods of compliance. This slide here basically deals with or emphasizes the hierarchy of controls. You know, we always try to engineer out the exposure first, and as our last resort, you know, we resort to PPE, and in this case it's going to be respiratory protection. Housekeeping requirements. The employer shall not allow dry sweeping or dry brushing where such activity could contribute to employee exposure to the silica. Unless wet sweeping, HEPA filtered, vacuuming, or other methods are not feasible. We have to be very, very careful when we talk about not feasible on this. It's very difficult to prove to OSHA that using one of the engineering controls is not feasible. The employer shall not allow compressed air to be used to clean clothes or surfaces where such activity could contribute to employee exposure to the silica. Unless the compressed air is used in conjunction with a ventilation system that will effectively capture the dust cloud created by the compressed air, wherever. You know, this could be important for concrete grinding or the polishing operations, where the machine actually, you know, vacuuming system actually collects the dust. We have to make sure, and OSHA also, the industrial hygienicist also emphasized this when I talked to her, that we need to control the dust when we're emptying the collection bags on the machine or we're cleaning out the filter. It doesn't do any good to go through the process of collecting all this dust and then at the end of the day take and have that high concentration of dust and expose the employee to it while we're cleaning the bag out or the filter. So that's something to make note of. All right, let's talk a little bit about the written exposure control plan. A lot of people have a problem with this, trying to figure out, oh my God, what is that? You know, how are we going to develop it? Well, we're going to help you with that. The employer shall establish and implement a written exposure control plan that contains at least the following elements. We need to describe what we're doing, the task that involves the exposure to the silica, whether it's grinding, polishing, chipping, anything like that, that's breaking down the silica particles so they're breathable. We need to describe the engineering controls, you know, whether we're going to use water or vacuuming system, that type of thing, work practices. If we're going to use respiratory protection, we have to describe the housekeeping measures used to limit the exposure. Not only to our employees, but we might be on a multi-employer job site. So, and again, this written exposure control plan is much like a job hazard analysis. Here's what the exposure is. Here's how we plan to control it. Continuing on with this plan, a description of the procedures used to restrict access into the work area when necessary. Again, we might be talking, we're on a job site where we have a lot of different trades. We have to make sure that we control, you know, the dust that we are producing, that we control it to everybody. That might be cordoning off the area or restricting access into the area where the operations are happening. We have to designate a competent person, okay? Now, I mentioned earlier, there's a lot in these last two slides about this written exposure control plan, and this is a big part of this whole silica standard for construction. I mentioned earlier during one of the OSHA-sponsored seminars I attended, they provided a website, www.silica-safe.org, that actually walks you through completing the plan. While CNA doesn't officially endorse this website, I got on it and completed a separate plan. I signed into the website, completed a plan, and found that it was a very simple process. I've been encouraging all the contractors and clients that I work with to do the same. To get on the website, develop a plan, use it as a template for future exposure control plans. Because for the most part, what we're doing day in and day out is not really going to change. So we're going to be able to use a lot of that, you know, that plan is going to be able to use over and over. In regards to the designated competent person, you know, it's going to be a person that knows or anticipates the potential for the silica exposure. They're going to make the initial evaluations on the work site. Hey, are we going to be able to use table 1? We're not going to be able to use this. Okay, we're going to have to go to the air monitoring, whatever. They're going to select and implement the engineering controls, you know, whether it be water or vacuuming, that type of thing. And they're also going to monitor this on a daily basis. And they're going to take, you know, they're going to have the authority to take the corrective action whenever needed. So one of the first things OSHA is going to ask probably when they get on a work site is who the competent person is for silica. So it should be in the written exposure control plan. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this plan also. We have other things that we can help you with that. Okay, let's talk about medical surveillance. This is one of the issues that Construction Industry Safety Coalition that the ASCC is part of is petitioning because of the foreseeable cost to contractors and employers. All right. General, the employer shall make medical surveillance available at no cost to the employee and at a reasonable time and place for each employee who will be required under this section to use a respirator for 30 or more days per year. Now, when we're talking medical surveillance, we're talking a full physical, chest x-rays, pulmonary function exam, and tuberculosis test. Remember, if you use a respirator, it's under the assumption that you have a respirator protection program already in place. Do not confuse the OSHA medical questionnaire and the respiratory protection program with the medical surveillance required in the Silica standard. They're two different things. Just a side note on that too, on the respiratory protection standard. That's been around since 2007. I had to give a talk at a safety directors forum in October of this past year. And during the talk, I held up a disposable N95 respirator, you know, one of the white ones, and I asked the group. Now granted, this is a group of safety professionals in the group of fairly large companies. I asked them how many of them were completing the required medical questionnaire and doing the fit testing under the guidelines of the respiratory protection program. Very few in the crowd raised their hands that they were complying with the standard. And again, the standard's been around a long time. So when they talk about the 30 days, all right, if you put a respirator on an employee for 1 minute during that day, that counts as one of those 30 days. Now we have to do this medical surveillance, has to be repeated every 3 years thereafter. The employer shall ensure that the medical examination and procedures required by this section are performed by a physician or another licensed healthcare professional. Continuing on the medical surveillance. The employer shall ensure that the physician or the healthcare professional explains to the employee the results of the medical examination. Now this is only to the employee, all right? And this has to be done. The report has to be, you have to contact the employee within 30 days of the medical examination. A statement which the employee only gets because of the HIPAA laws is going to indicate the results of the examination to include any medical conditions that the employee might have that would increase the risk, health risk for exposure to silica. And also, there's going to be the healthcare professional or physician. They have to provide a recommendation within 30 days to the employer on any recommended limitations of the employee using a respirator. One more slide on medical surveillance, continuing on that. And this is basically for the employer. Any recommended limitations on the employee's exposure to the silica has to be made in a statement. I tell you, if you get a statement from a physician or a medical professional that says that there's going to be complications if this person wears a respirator, due to the additional cost and the additional tests and that type of thing, I would highly recommend that person probably should not be one of the people designated to wear the respirator. Because eventually that's going to mean more cost to you as the employer. The employer shall obtain a written medical opinion within 30 days. The written opinion shall contain the date of what the examination was on the employee, statement that the examination meets all the requirements of the Silica standard under this section, the medical surveillance, and any recommended limitations on the employee's use of a respirator, or that there are no limitations on that. Employee training, which is much like other standard OSHA standards. Okay? We want to make sure that we train our employees. Well, first of all, we want to make sure that as an employer that we're following the hazard communication standard. Okay, so which that should be day one when an employee is hired in, new hire orientation. Train them that we have a hazard communication standard and these are the parts of the standard. We need to make sure that we include the silica, the respirable crystalline silica in this program. We need to make sure also that we let the employee know in the employee training of the potential hazards and health hazards of crystalline silica. Cancer, lung effects, immune system effects, kidney disease, COPD, silicosis, lung disease, that type of thing. One of the things too that the OSHA industrial hygienist suggested that if you're cutting a concrete product, you definitely should have an SDS on cement there in your hazard communication binder there. So continuing on employee training, again, we need to make sure that the employee knows the health hazards associated with silica. That might give them a much better idea that, hey, we need to do things right. I need to follow the controls. I need to make sure I'm wetting down or I'm using the vacuum system correctly or I'm using the respirator properly. Okay. We need to let the employees know the specific tasks, all right? When you're grinding this particular task or when you're polishing or you're cutting or whatever, if you don't, we're going to need to follow the particular control methods, engineering controls, to limit your exposure to the silica. We need to make sure that we identify the competent person or persons because we might have a number of competent people on different job sites. And we also want to let them know, and again, this goes back to the health hazards associated with the silica. We want to let them know the description of the medical surveillance, what they can expect when they go to the doctor, that they're going to have chest x-rays, they're going to have a full physical, they're going to get a TB test, pulmonary lung function test. All that training, we need to make sure that we let the employees know all that. All right, winding down here a little bit. Record-keeping guidelines. Record-keeping guidelines really are no different than other standard requirements. We want to make sure that we keep all of our air sampling or monitoring data. Any of our objective data, whether it's air exchange calculations, industrial hygiene testing results, that type of thing. We're going to want to make sure that the medical surveillance, everything on every employee, that we keep all the records from the employees covered under the medical surveillance. And again, everything has to be maintained a minimum of 30 years. All right, this right here, gang, is probably one of the best publications I think OSHA has ever put out. It's a small entity compliance guide. It was published in November of last year. Don't let the name fool you on this. It's a small entity. It's good for all size companies. This publication walks you through step by step of the requirements of the Silica standard for construction. It walks you through everything on table 1. It gives pictures. It gives examples of the different tasks on table 1. It gives you suggestions on the engineering controls. It talks about the written exposure control plan. It even gives you a sample written exposure control plan on page 46 of the 100 pages on this publication. So if you ever wondered what needed to be in the plan, OSHA put it out, the sample, so I would suggest that you follow that example. Or you can go to the silica-safe.org website on it. Now, you can go to the OSHA website, osha.gov, and in the search engine, just put in their small entity compliance guide, and this guide will pop up. So again, it's a great, I personally think it's one of the best resources material, reference materials that OSHA's put out. All right, here's that website that I've been referring to. All right, it's www.silica-safe.org. When you go on the website, this is the screen, part of the screen that's going to pop up. You see in the red box there, you're going to see Control the Dust, Create a Plan. You click on Create a Plan, and it brings up a template for the written exposure control plan. It's going to ask you different questions regarding the type of material you're using. Concrete, clay, whatever type of material. You check that box. It's going to ask you what the task, what are you doing? Are you cutting, grinding, chipping? It's going to ask you that. It's going to ask you what type of equipment you're going to use. If you're going to use a saw, is it a stationary mounted saw? Is it a handheld mounted saw? Is it a polishing machine? That type of thing. And they're going to ask you what you're actually doing on that. It's, at the end, you're going to be able to print this out. And I've been encouraging all the people, all the clients that I work with, get on this website, fill it out. What's neat about this website, too, as you go to the different boxes, the different checkoff boxes, you might not be sure what type of verbiage you want to put in it. You can click, they've got a drop-down box on some of the boxes. You can click on that, and it gives you examples of the verbiage, what OSHA is looking for, what needs to be maintained in that box to help you out. At the end, you click on Save That, and you can print it out. I tell everybody, print that thing out, use that as a template, because for the most part, what everybody does day in and day out is pretty much the same. Yeah, things are going to change. Your competent people are going to change. What you're doing is probably going to change as far as the project, that type of thing. But again, you can use this website, or you can go to page 46 as well on that small entity Silica compliance guide, and use that as an example. The written exposure control plan, it needs to be evaluated and on a yearly basis, reviewed and evaluated at a minimum on an annual basis, because there's going to be stuff in this plan that's going to change. People are going to change. They're going to be your competent people. Maybe your tasks are changed. Maybe the type of material or equipment you're using are going to change. So on a yearly basis, it needs to be reviewed and updated. That's at a minimum. Here's some other references and resources that can help you out. The American Society for Testing and Materials. They've got a guide out that actually goes over the silica standard for construction and demolition activities for controlling the silica. The American Industrial Hygiene Association, they actually have a white paper out that it has a recommended skill set and capabilities for the competent person. It goes into detail quite a bit on the particular attributes a competent person needs on it. The last one there is on the NIOSH website, Engineering Controls for Silica and Construction. Again, it's another good resource that you can use. I can't encourage you enough, though, to go to that small entity compliance guide and look through there. Well, we are to the questions section, and you see there on the slide the ASCC members have access to a free safety and insurance hotline, 866-788-2722. And I guess we can take questions now. I'm going to ask Katie Stryker, she's our CNA Risk Control Manager for Industrial Hygiene Services, to assist me on any questions that you might have, and hopefully we can help you sort this standard out a little better. So if there's any questions, I'm ready to take them at this time.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you have a question, please press star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you're using a speakerphone, you may need to pick up the handset first before pressing the numbers. Once again, that is star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone for a question. And we do have a question from Janet Stanton. Please go ahead.
Hi. I'm from New York, and I've been attending a lot of meetings about the changes in the standard. And what we're being told in New York is that the competent person cannot just be somebody who you as a company designate as a competent person, but that they're going to have special training. And I've looked all over. I can't find anybody that does competent person training for Silica. So I'm thinking maybe this is one of the things that has delayed the startup date on this, because I know certainly in New York they're trying to come up with like a 4-hour course that people would have to take. And they're saying that parts of it have to be taught by an industrial hygienist, and I just wanted to know if you heard anything about that, or if there's any information that you've been getting about there having to be actual training for a competent person for Silica.
I'm going to answer part of that, and then I'm going to ask Katie to chime in on that. I know that one of the issues that the Construction Industry Safety Coalition has under legal view, and it's an issue, is the definition of a competent person for Silica. Mm-hmm. I have not heard yet what direction that is going in. At this time, I'm suggesting to the clients that I work with to try to use the Table 1 that OSHA has given us and try to be as simplistic as possible on it. I identify the silica exposure, and also, make sure that you have the knowledge to use the right engineering controls, monitor it, and go from there. I do know that that is one of the things that is under question. As far as the New York part of it, I'm not familiar with that. Katie, maybe you could chime in on that. I know that when it comes to the air sampling or the monitoring, that is going to involve a much more detailed part of the competent person.
Mm. And
yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to chime in and say, unfortunately, I don't know state-specific concerns or discussions that have occurred, but to my knowledge, OSHA defines part of the definition of the competent person is that they can fulfill the responsibilities of the written exposure control plan. So probably where we're getting, where you are getting questions on formal training by an industrial hygienist, that competent person needs to fully understand how that sampling is being performed and be able to state that, yes, that sampling that was performed either in-house or by a third party is accurate and representative of the tasks where we have a potential silica exposure. So they need to understand a little bit more. That's not to say they need to be able to perform the air monitoring, but they need to understand the process and the potential health effects. So really a deeper dive than what OSHA is expecting all of the employees to know. So to my knowledge, I didn't know, and I can look into this again too, that there was formal training required, but it was more if you don't have someone that has that knowledge level, they need to seek training to get to that level.
Right. Well, New York, I can definitely tell you, you know, OSHA is kind of the bottom standard, and everybody goes above and beyond that. So, the Department of Buildings here, I mean, there's training for everything, and it's specific training, and it's, you know, you have to go for it, and it has to be a trainer that they approve, and without that, you don't do what you need to do in New York. So that's why I'm just kind of thinking for Silica, there's definitely going to be something coming down the pike as far as that's concerned, because I could see people being a little uncomfortable in a company if they have to be the ones that are going to be assessing the situation, or if they're supposed to be the one who says, oh, well, you're exposed here. You know, how does somebody know that? And that's going to be based on testing. And are companies allowed to do their own testing, or is there going to be some kind of standardized testing that's put out there with numbers of what general tasks generate as far as the dust? I mean, it's
Right.
complicated.
Yeah, and I haven't heard anything as far as it needing to be third-party testing. But you know, that again goes back to that competent person. And if you're doing in-house testing, the person completing that testing must be competent with Silica, with the procedures, et cetera. So absolutely, you know, if New York goes above and beyond and requires certain training, that's what I would comply with. But like I said, I don't, unfortunately, really know all of the state nuances and what's happening in each one of those states.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our next question comes from Douglas Martin. Your line is open.
Yeah, good afternoon. Is there any push to expand the Table 1 listing of tasks? I was recently at an industry seminar here in Chicago, and one of the tasks that came up for a lot of concrete contractors was early entry sawing, you know, soft cut type saws where water is not really feasible to use. But there are HEPA vacuums that are used on those saws. Any guidance there?
Yeah. Doug, I tell you what, when I met with the OSHA industrial hygienist, she basically told me that Table 1 was a gift, that originally they didn't even want to include Table 1 in the standards. But I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, I think Table 1 is I don't think that is one of the issues that's under the legal review right now. I know that I know that it's limited as far as if you know what you can use in Table 1. I know that a lot of times water is not an option. Had this problem when we're dealing with road builders. You can only put so much water on a road, otherwise it won't meet the DOT specs, you know, to keep the dust down and things like that. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know if Table 1 is going to be expanded. I don't think it is.
Okay.
And I'll chime in with that as well. To my knowledge, there has not been discussion on expanding Table 1, but OSHA does in the standard outline what they call objective data. So if you can produce objective data that fits with that task or operation at hand and it's from a reputable source, you can use that as well to determine if you would be above or below the action level or below a level which requires compliance. So industry organization
Okay,
or...
so is that something that ASCC or other industry groups would be willing to produce? Because otherwise, each contractor is going to have to do their own air monitoring to come up with that data, which
Right. I don't know.
Doing that, that's a lot of duplicated effort when many of us are.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, and unfortunately,
I saws and vacuums in the same manner that contractors all over the country are using.
Maybe that's something that once we establish through the air monitoring process, maybe that's something that the associations could adopt, like you say, so we don't have to duplicate on every contractor, duplicate the same thing, because that's a great expense.
Right, and not only do we have to pay for it once, but if the results come back above the action level, then we have to do that every 3 months until we can satisfy OSHA that there's a certain level that's expected given these engineering controls. And I don't know how long that is, and I don't know if you know how long that is. Whether that's 2 years worth of monitoring, 3 years worth of monitoring, what is it?
Katie, do you know, as far as the time duration when you do monitoring, is it required? Are you required to monitor when conditions change, or what's the?
The standard really just says that you have to, based upon your level. So if you fall above the PEL, I believe it's every 3 months, and then if you're in between the action level and permissible exposure, it is every 6 months. My understanding with that is to encourage the use or implementation of engineering controls. And once you can confirm that engineering controls that you have implemented reduce your exposure below that action level, and you can confirm through air monitoring 2 times in a row, then you can stop the sampling. So I am not aware of any time frame as far as you must complete this, for a duration, every 6 months for 2 years. It's just every 6 months until you can get those levels below. Unfortunately, in the construction industry, as you all are aware, environmental conditions change. So again, they do put, some time stipulations around, the frequency of which you sample and space between when you sample. But again, I agree. It is costly, and I think that's one of the pushes from the coalition is that to comply with the monitoring requirement pieces, will be extremely costly for a contractor.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Amy Johnston. Please go ahead.
Hi. I was at a safety conference yesterday watching about an hour and a half presentation on the same thing. And they basically told us, even if you're following Table 1, this was someone from my OSHA, they told us even if you're following Table 1, you still have to use monitoring on every single case. And what you said today kind of contradicts that. So, I'm a flooring contractor. I'm not a concrete guy, just so you know. So maybe I'm not affected quite as hard, but I am prepping the concrete, whether it be new or old, hence I'm disturbing it and causing,
So Michigan OSHA, the people told you from Michigan OSHA that even though you're following Table 1, you still have to do air monitoring?
Yes, and what they said, because the first question brought up was,
is MyOSHA going to have a different law than OSHA? And they said no. They're just going to slap the word MyOSHA on top of it. You know, they're not going to change anything. It's going to be the same as OSHA's law. But they said yesterday in this that, yeah, like all the time you have to do monitoring.
Well, that completely contradicts, and I, you know,
Right.
It completely contradicts the reason behind Table 1. I'm not sure that's news to me on that. I know that other OSHA people that I've talked to around the country, whatever, are like, use Table 1, and if you comply with Table 1 and there's no visible silica dust, you're in compliance. As far as that part of the standard.
Right.
Where, you know, so I'm not sure where that, that sounds like MyOSHA might be going up and above, which to me that totally takes out the whole reason why we have Table 1.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious about that because it contradicts. I do have another class on April 27th as well, so I'm going to ask the same question. So don't be.
Okay, good. Good.
I'm going to like 6 of them, just so you know.
Yeah.
But, you know, because I didn't even, you know, he kind of was surprised I was in the class. He's like, "What are you doing in here as a flooring contractor and not a concrete guy?" And it's like, you know, technically speaking, when I demo ceramic, there's silica in ceramic. So we have to come up with a new way to demo ceramic, you know, because obviously if you have, you know, you're not going to have a jackhammer or a big ride-on machine that you can put a vacuum on. So are we going to wet it? Or it's probably going to end up having to be respirator, you know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my boss and I have already made the executive decision. We no longer will demo ceramic. Like, we're just going to take it out of the services we offer.
Yeah, there is
you know, so
on the last task on the first page of Table 1 does talk about using a handheld jackhammer.
Right, which we rarely use. So,
Yeah.
like, we usually use a ride-on machine, and
Right.
and so, you know, it's just he was pretty surprised I was there. You know, just because I was a flooring guy, and I don't think a lot of flooring contractors realize that this affects us. Every bag of floor prep we mix, there's silica in it. Every bag of ceramic mastic, there's silica in it. You know, a lot of it, flooring adhesives have them in it. So, you know, so I think I kind of threw him for a loop. So.
and if you have to,
Go ahead, Bill.
no, I was just saying if you in prepping the floor too, you're probably going to grind the concrete or whatever, and then you're going to be exposed to that, you know, as well.
Yeah. Well, what I do, like a lot of people have the sanders, and they might have vacuums on it, but they're not vacuums that are compliant with Table 1. Because that's been the big thing. I've called a bunch of the people I've bought my equipment from that have these like little mini vacuums on it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Can you tell me what this filter goes to?" And they pretty much won't. So I kind of got my answer by them telling me. So, like, we have to replace a whole fleet of equipment. I have 27 of those flooring machines that I have to complete, that I'm going to end up replacing to get a HEPA vac versus the normal vac that you can buy with those. Like, I have to buy 27 new machines for our company.
Now, there is in Table 1, there's walk-behind milling machines or floor grinders. Would those machines fall under that?
We think so. So we're not quite sure. Like, I brought that up yesterday, too. I didn't know, you know, when I'm using what we call a sander or a swing machine, what did that actually fall under? Because, you know, I'm obviously disturbing the substrate. And so, you know, he thought it would be under walk-behind milling machines and floor grinders. And so, but the thing on there is the majority of the, we call them sanders here, or at least at my company, the majority of the sanding machines, have vacuums on them already, but, you know, they don't have a filter with 99%.
Right.
So when I've now called the manufacturers of the machines that I bought them for, asking them, you know, these filters and these replacement filters I keep buying, what do they go up to? They won't tell me, which tells me they're not compliant. Like, they just won't tell me, period. You know, and none of the vacuums have like a little brand name on it so I could go Google or anything. So, you know, like I said, I found out about this because of Install, and I was glad that I could, you know, pay to be on this, because I don't think a lot of people have realized this affects flooring contractors as well. So,
yeah.
You know, and if you all want to take over concrete polishing, be my guest, because I think my boss is going to stop doing that as well. So, just because of liabilities. So, anyway. But yeah, I don't know what the answer is. Like I said, he told us you have to monitor everything. Because my big thing at this conference yesterday as well was, okay, I got to monitor everything, but like, I don't even know how to begin to do that, because as a flooring contractor, I've never monitored the air, ever.
Now, when he said monitoring, was he indicating maybe that?
Even if you were doing what Table 1 said, like, so for example, I don't know, use one where I don't care which one you know, the first one on there. Like, even though I don't do that, if I was using handheld saws, okay, and when it talks, well, I've kind of wanted one with a HEPA vac, sorry, but anyways, they were pretty much saying even if you have the HEPA on with a 99% filter, you still have to monitor the air to make sure that that is actually working. Now that's what he told us in this class.
Yeah, that's news to me as well. And my only thought is that is going above and beyond what the OSHA standard requires, the federal OSHA standard. And if the company chose to do that, you know, it could help from a defensibility standpoint to say, we're following Table 1 and look, here are our results. From air monitoring. But like Bill said, that statement is pretty much contradicting why they chose to include Table 1. And then I will also say, if you haven't looked at the small entity guide that Bill mentioned, I would,
no, I haven't.
Because they go into a little more detail on Table 1 about specific tasks and operations, so you could really see if some of your tasks fall within that category or in one of those tasks. And then lastly, you might look, because other flooring contractors that I've worked with really fall into the general industry and would comply with the general industry standards versus the construction standards.
See, now again, they told us completely the opposite yesterday.
Okay. Well, and again, like Bill said, maybe my OSHA is doing things just a little bit differently. You know, we're speaking to the federal OSHA standards that we have, but you know, it's interesting. I mean, you know, I've worked with just a few flooring contractors that have done some monitoring over the past many years, and we consider them a general industry company. So,
fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have no further questions at this time.
Okay, well, thank everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
This concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.